There is a deeply rooted American dream of leaving everything behind. When the stress of modern life, the noise of the city, and the crushing weight of daily responsibilities become too much, people often fantasize about packing up their car and moving to the middle of nowhere. They believe that if they can just find a quiet piece of land deep in the mountains, they can start over. They believe the wilderness will wash away their problems. But the wilderness is entirely indifferent to human struggles. It does not heal you. It only amplifies whatever you bring into it. If you walk into the deep woods carrying paranoia, fear, and unresolved darkness, the isolation will not cure you. It will consume you. This is the tragic and deeply unsettling reality of a family who drove up into a remote mountain range looking for peace, only to vanish into thin air, leaving behind a trail of clues that are so bizarre they defy all logical explanation. Before we unpack one of the most baffling and chilling unsolved mysteries in modern history, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. The year was 2009. Bobby Jamison was 44 years old, and his wife, Sherilyn Jamison, was 40. They lived in the small town of Eufaula, Oklahoma, along with their beautiful 6-year-old daughter, Madison, and their small pet dog, a mixed breed named Maisie. On paper, they looked like a normal family, but behind the closed doors of their home, their lives were slowly unraveling. Bobby had recently been involved in a severe car accident that left him with chronic, debilitating back pain. To manage the pain, he was prescribed heavy medication, which profoundly altered his mood and energy levels. Sherilyn struggled with her own severe bouts of depression and bipolar disorder. As the medical bills piled up and their physical and mental health deteriorated, the family became increasingly isolated. They stopped talking to their neighbors. They pulled Madison out of public school. The walls of their home seemed to be closing in on them. In the months leading up to October of 2009, Bobby and Sherilyn began exhibiting behavior that was deeply alarming. They started telling the few people they still spoke to that their house was haunted, but they were not talking about simple bumps in the night. Bobby seriously claimed that there were hostile, invisible spirits living on the roof of their house. He became so consumed by this delusion that he actually went to a local pastor and asked him if there was a specific type of bullet he could buy that would allow him to shoot and kill ghosts. Sherilyn, feeding off this shared paranoia, went out and purchased a .22 caliber handgun, claiming they needed to defend themselves against the entities that were stalking their family. Driven by this overwhelming fear and a desperate desire for a fresh start, the Jamisons decided they needed to move. They wanted to buy a 40-acre plot of land deep in the Bois Mountains, near the even smaller town of Red Oak, Oklahoma. It was a rugged, heavily wooded, and isolated area. They planned to buy a shipping container, place it on the land, and live completely off the grid, far away from whatever they believed was hunting them. On October 8, 2009, the family prepared to leave for a short trip to view the land. But before they left, their home security camera captured something that would later become a cornerstone of this terrifying mystery. The camera was pointed at their driveway, recording the family as they packed their white pickup truck. The footage is incredibly disturbing to watch. It is completely silent, but the visual alone is enough to make your skin crawl. For over 2 hours, Bobby and Sherilyn are seen walking back and forth from the house to the truck. They are carrying completely mundane items, but the way they are moving is entirely unnatural. They are walking with a stiff, mechanical gait, almost like zombies. They walk past each other dozens of times in the narrow driveway, but they never make eye contact. They never stop to speak to each other. They just move back and forth in a bizarre, silent trance, their faces entirely devoid of emotion. Later that day, they loaded Madison and the dog into the truck and drove away, heading east toward the mountains. 9 days passed, On October 17th, a group of local hunters were riding their all-terrain vehicles deep in the Bois mountains. They were navigating a narrow, deeply rutted dirt path that was miles away from any paved highway. The terrain was incredibly rough, flanked by dense timber and steep ravines. As they rounded a bend, they saw a white pickup truck parked awkwardly on the side of the dirt trail. The hunters stopped their vehicles. They recognized the truck immediately. They had driven past this exact spot a few days earlier and had seen the truck sitting there. The fact that it had not moved in days in such a remote area was highly unusual. They walked up to the vehicle to see if someone needed help. The truck was locked. The hunters peered through the dirty glass of the windows. The inside of the cab was a mess of clothing, maps, and wrappers. But then, they saw something moving in the back seat. Curled up on a pile of jackets was Maisie, the family dog. The dog was severely emaciated, trembling, and barely clinging to life. She had been locked inside the freezing, airtight truck for over a week with absolutely no food or water. Realizing something was terribly wrong, the hunters immediately called the local sheriff's department. When the police arrived, they had to physically break the window to get the dog out and unlock the doors. Maisie was rushed to an animal clinic where she miraculously survived. But as the investigators began to inventory the contents of the truck, the situation escalated from an abandoned vehicle case into an absolute nightmare. Inside the truck, the police found Bobby's wallet, containing his identification and credit cards. They found Sherilyn's purse. They found both of their cell phones. They found the family's global positioning system unit, which showed that they had driven further up the mountain, stopped, and then driven back down to this specific spot before turning the engine off. They found the heavy winter coats the family would have desperately needed in the freezing autumn mountain air. But the most shocking discovery was located underneath the driver's seat. Tucked away in a bank bag was $32,000 in pure, hard cash. The investigators were completely baffled. If the family had been robbed, the criminals would have certainly taken the massive sum of money. If they had simply gotten out of the truck to go for a short walk and gotten lost, why did they leave their dog locked inside the vehicle to slowly starve to death? Why would they lock the doors behind them? And why would they leave their heavy coats inside when the temperature outside was rapidly dropping? A massive search and rescue operation was immediately launched. Over 100 volunteers, police officers with tracking dogs, and men on horseback scoured the rugged terrain surrounding the truck. They combed through the dense brush, checked the deep ravines, and searched the abandoned coal mines that dotted the landscape. The tracking dogs caught a faint scent leading away from the truck, but it quickly vanished into the wind. They searched for days, expanding the radius further and further out. They found absolutely nothing. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed the three of them whole. As the detectives dug into the evidence left inside the truck, they made a deeply unsettling discovery on one of the cell phones. It was a photograph of 6-year-old Madison. The picture appeared to have been taken somewhere on the mountain, likely on the day they disappeared. In the photo, Madison is standing with her arms crossed over her chest, but it is her expression that haunts anyone who looks at the image. She is not smiling. She looks incredibly distressed, as if she has been crying, and her eyes are looking slightly off camera, staring at someone or something with a look of pure fear. It was the last known photograph of the little girl alive. The sheer lack of physical evidence led to a chaotic storm of theories. Some investigators believed that Bobby and Sherilyn, caught in the grip of a shared, drug-induced psychosis, simply wandered off into the woods and succumbed to the elements. The area was notoriously dangerous, filled with steep drops and wild animals. But this theory could not explain why they would lock the truck, leave the money, and condemn their beloved dog. Others theorized that they had stumbled across a drug manufacturing operation. The Bois Mountains were known to be a hiding place for illegal methamphetamine labs. If the Jamisons had accidentally walked onto a cartel's territory while looking for land, they might have been executed to protect the secret. But again, ruthless criminals do not typically leave $32,000 in cash sitting under a seat. Another terrifying theory suggested a murder-suicide plot. Did the intense paranoia finally push one of the parents past the breaking point? Did they force their family to march out into the freezing wilderness to end it all? But without bodies, and without a weapon found in the immediate area, the police had nothing but empty speculation. The case officially went cold. For 4 years, the mystery of the Jamison family haunted the state of Oklahoma. Then, on November 16, 2013, the silence of the mountains was finally broken. Another group of hunters were trekking through a deeply isolated section of the forest, roughly 3 miles away from the spot where the white pickup truck had been abandoned 4 years earlier. This specific area had not been thoroughly searched during the initial investigation because it was extremely difficult to access and incredibly far for a 6-year-old child to walk through dense, thorny brush. One of the hunters noticed something pale contrasting against the dark autumn leaves. As he walked closer, the horrifying reality of what he was looking at came into focus. Lying on the forest floor were the skeletal remains of 3 human beings. The police were immediately notified. The medical examiner arrived at the scene. Because the bodies had been exposed to the harsh elements and scavenging animals for 4 years, there was very little physical evidence left. But the arrangement of the remains told a silent, tragic story. The 3 skeletons belonged to Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison. They were found lying face down, side by side, perfectly parallel to one another. The medical examiner took the remains back to the laboratory for a thorough analysis. The bones were heavily weathered. They could not determine the exact cause of death for Sherilyn or Madison due to the severe decomposition. There were no broken bones to suggest a fall, and no obvious knife marks. However, when they examined Bobby's skull, they found a small, mysterious hole. The coroner could not definitively state whether the hole was caused by a bullet from a small-caliber weapon or if it was the result of animal activity over the years. Because the evidence was so degraded, the official cause of death for all 3 members of the Jamison family was ruled as undetermined. The discovery of the bodies only deepened the terrifying mystery. How did they get 3 miles away from their truck? The terrain was brutal. If they were lost and freezing, basic survival instincts dictate that you stay near your vehicle, which provides shelter. Why did they walk purposefully into the deepest, most unforgiving part of the woods? And why did they lay down side by side? If they were forced out there by someone else, why lay them out so methodically? If it was a murder-suicide, where was the weapon? The .22 caliber handgun that Sherilyn had purchased was never found inside the truck, and it was never found near the bodies. Did one of them use it, and then an animal carried it away? Or did someone else walk away with it? The truth of what happened on that cold October day remains buried in those mountains. But the most terrifying explanation is the one that forces us to look inward. The Jamisons were running away from invisible ghosts. They were running away from the suffocating pressure of their failing health, their financial ruin, and the demons taking root inside their own minds. When they locked the doors of their truck and walked into the dark, silent forest, they brought that paranoia with them. It is entirely possible that in the grip of an intense, shared psychological breakdown, the rustling of the wind in the trees sounded like footsteps. The shadows of the branches looked like the entities they believed were hunting them. Driven by blind, absolute terror, they abandoned their vehicle, abandoned their money, and forced their daughter to march deeper and deeper into the wilderness to escape an enemy that did not exist. When exhaustion and the freezing cold finally overtook them, they laid down together, holding onto each other as the darkness closed in. This tragic story leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It speaks to a profound truth about human nature. We spend so much energy trying to outrun our problems. We change our jobs, we move to new cities, and we dream of escaping into the isolation of nature, believing that a change of scenery will bring us peace. but physical distance cannot cure an internal wound. The shadows we refuse to confront in the daylight will inevitably follow us into the dark. It teaches us a quiet lesson about the absolute necessity of facing our struggles directly. It reminds us that sincerity, patience, and the courage to ask for help when our minds begin to fail us are the only true ways to survive. The isolation they sought did not protect them. It simply provided a quiet, empty stage for their deepest fears to become a devastating reality. Life requires us to stand our ground and deal with the broken pieces of our lives, because the further we run into the unknown, the harder it becomes to ever find our way back. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves an experienced hiker who went out for a short walk in a popular national park, only to vanish into thin air, leaving behind a trail of bizarre clues that made even seasoned search and rescue experts question the laws of nature. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. Imagine being entirely engulfed in absolute, suffocating darkness. You cannot move your arms. You cannot move your legs. The air you breathe is thick with the taste of ancient dust and damp clay. Every time you exhale, the solid stone walls surrounding you seem to shift, squeezing your chest just a fraction tighter. The blood rushes to your head, your heart pounds frantically against your ribs, and the only sound you can hear is your own ragged, panicked breathing, echoing in a space no larger than a washing machine. This is not a terrifying nightmare you can wake up from. For one man, this was the chilling reality of a family holiday gone horribly, unimaginably wrong. If you find yourself drawn to true stories that explore the strange, dark, and mysterious corners of our world, you have come to the right place. We tell stories just like this one, focusing on the deeply unsettling and the bizarre. Before we dive into the pitch-black depths of today's narrative, please sneak into the like button's house, locate their favorite bottle of shampoo, replace the contents entirely with superglue, and then calmly walk out the front door. The year was 2009. It was the week of Thanksgiving, a time usually reserved for warmth, family dinners, and gratitude. John Edward Jones, a 26-year-old medical student, had traveled back to his home state of Utah with his wife and their young daughter. They were expecting their second child soon, and life for John was full of promise. He was known among his friends and family as a warm, devout, and deeply caring individual. He was tall, athletic, and in his youth, he had been an avid caver. He and his brother Josh used to spend their weekends exploring the various cave systems scattered across Utah, navigating the dark subterranean worlds with the fearless energy of youth. But as John grew older, went to college, got married, and entered medical school, those caving adventures had faded into fond memories. He had not been in a cave for years. However, with the family gathered for the holiday and a few days of free time stretching out before them, a wave of nostalgia hit the brothers. They decided to organize a small expedition with some friends and family members to visit a place they had heard of but never fully conquered. It was a local favorite, known as Nutty Putty Cave. Nutty Putty Cave was not your typical grand cavern filled with massive stalactites and underground lakes. Discovered in 1960, it was a hydrothermal cave, meaning it was formed by superheated water cutting through the limestone from below. This process left behind a sprawling, chaotic labyrinth of narrow tubes, tight squeezes, and sharp drops. The walls of Nutty Putty were coated in a viscous, clay-like mud that felt sticky and slippery all at once, which is exactly how the cave earned its peculiar name. Because of its narrow passages, the cave was infamous among the local spelunking community. It demanded visitors to crawl on their bellies, contort their bodies, and squeeze through terrifyingly tight spaces. At around 8 p.m. on the evening of November 24th, the group arrived at the desolate, rocky hill that marked the entrance of the cave. The weather above ground was freezing, a harsh winter chill biting at their faces, but as they descended into the mouth of Nutty Putty, the temperature rose significantly. The earth insulated the cave, keeping it at a humid, stagnant 70 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. They switched on their headlamps, the beams of light cutting through the absolute darkness, and began their descent. For the first hour, everything went exactly as planned. The group navigated through the initial, wider sections of the cave. They slid down a slick, muddy incline known as the Big Slide, laughing and chatting, enjoying the thrill of the underground exploration. John and Josh, feeling confident, decided they wanted to push further into the more challenging depths of the system. They split from the main group, aiming for a notorious section of the cave known as the Birth Canal. The Birth Canal was a famously tight tunnel that forced cavers to squeeze through a space barely wide enough for a human torso, before suddenly opening up into a spacious, comfortable cavern where they could stand up and rest. John took the lead. He crawled on his stomach through the winding muddy tubes, his headlamp sweeping across the identical-looking walls of gray and brown rock. Without realizing it, in the confusing and unmapped lower sections of the cave, John took a wrong turn. He had bypassed the actual birth canal entirely and was now dragging himself into a highly dangerous, unmapped fissure known only to a few hardcore cavers. As Ed's push, the tunnel began to slope downward at a severe angle. The ceiling lowered, and the walls pressed in closer to his shoulders. John, assuming this was the famous birth canal he had heard about, believed that if he just pushed a little further, he would pop out into the large room on the other side. So, he kept going. He wriggled forward like a worm, using his elbows and toes to inch his way down the increasingly steep incline. Soon, the tunnel became so narrow that he could no longer use his arms to pull himself forward. His arms were pinned against his sides, and one arm was forced backward above his head. The tunnel then took a sharp, nearly 90-degree downward drop. John, fighting against gravity and the slick mud, slid forward headfirst into the vertical crevice. Suddenly, his chest became wedged against the unyielding stone. He was stuck. He was nearly upside down, trapped at an agonizing 70-degree angle. The space was barely 10 inches wide and 18 inches high. To put that into perspective, it is the size of the opening of a standard front-loading washing machine, but made of jagged, immovable rock. John exhaled, trying to make his chest smaller to slip through, but as he let the air out of his lungs, his body slid an inch deeper into the narrow V-shaped wedge of the crevice. When he instinctively tried to inhale again, his chest could not expand. The rock walls were pressing directly against his ribs. Panic, cold and sharp, immediately set in. He tried to wiggle backward, but his body was completely corked in the hole. Every slight movement only caused him to sink deeper due to the slick clay and the steep downward angle. He called out for his brother. Josh, who was a few yards behind him in the tunnel, heard the muffled, panicked cries. He crawled forward until he saw John's boots protruding from the tiny hole in the floor of the tunnel. Josh reached down, grabbed his brother's calves, and pulled with all his might. For a brief second, John slid upward, but the space was so cramped that Josh could not get a proper grip. When Josh's hands slipped, John immediately slid back down into the crevice, wedging himself even deeper than before. The sheer force of the drop slammed John's chest into the rock, knocking the wind out of him in a terrifying gasp. Through the narrow gap, John managed to speak. His voice was strained, thick with terror. He told Josh that he could not breathe, that he was trapped, and that he needed help. Josh, realizing the horrifying reality of the situation, knew he could not pull John out alone. He told his brother to stay calm, prayed with him for a brief moment, and then scrambled backward through the twisting, claustrophobic tunnels to reach the surface. Once outside, breathing the freezing night air, Josh called 911. It was now roughly 9:30 p.m. The response was massive. Within an hour, the desolate dirt road leading to the cave was lit up by the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers, fire trucks, and search and rescue vehicles. Over 130 rescue workers, including the most experienced volunteer cavers in the region, descended upon the site. They set up a command center, brought in massive floodlights, and began organizing a rescue operation. The first rescuer to reach John was a woman named Susie. She was small, agile, and an expert in navigating tight subterranean spaces. It took her over an hour of agonizing crawling through the muddy labyrinth just to reach the spot where Josh had left his brother. When she finally arrived, all she could see were the soles of John's climbing boots sticking out from the jagged hole. She called out to him. John's voice came back, weak, muffled, and laced with exhaustion. He asked her if she was there to get him out. He told her he really wanted to get out. Susie assessed the situation, and the reality she reported back to the surface was grim. John was wedged in the worst possible position imaginable. Because he was completely upside down, his body was fighting a losing battle against gravity. The human circulatory system is not designed to function upside down for extended periods. Gravity was pulling all of his blood down into his brain and his lungs. His heart was being forced to pump twice as hard to push the blood back up to his legs. Fluid was already beginning to build up in his lungs, a condition known as pulmonary edema, making every single breath a monumental struggle. Furthermore, the space was simply too small for any specialized rescue equipment. They could not use jackhammers or explosives to widen the tunnel because the vibrations would likely cause a cave-in, crushing John instantly. The rock surrounding him was solid limestone, too hard to chip away by hand in such a cramped position. The only option was to pull him out by his feet. For the next 12 hours, the rescue effort was a grueling, heart-wrenching test of endurance. Rescuers worked in shifts, crawling down into the claustrophobic nightmare, staying with John, giving him sips of water through a long tube, and trying to keep him awake and calm. They lowered a two-way radio down to him so he could speak with his wife, who was waiting in absolute agony on the surface. Her voice, echoing through the dark, cold stone, was the only thing keeping John tethered to the world above. The rescue team eventually devised a plan. They would drill heavy-duty climbing anchors into the walls of the tunnel above John, thread a specialized rope through the anchors to create a complex pulley system, tie the rope around John's legs, and have a team of men pull in unison. It was a brutal, physically demanding strategy, but it was their only hope. By late afternoon of November 25th, nearly 20 hours into the ordeal, the pulley system was finally rigged. The air in the cave was thick with sweat, clay dust, and desperate hope. The command was given to pull. 8 strong men, wedged awkwardly in the tunnel above, hauled back on the rope. Slowly, agonizingly, John's body began to move upward. The friction against the rock ripped his clothes and scraped his skin, and John screamed in severe pain. Because the tunnel had a bend in it, as they pulled him up by his feet, his legs were being forced against the low ceiling of the tunnel above him. The angle was breaking his body, but it was working. They managed to pull him up several feet. For the first time in almost a day, John was able to make eye contact with one of his rescuers. He looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot from the pooling blood, his face covered in mud, but he was out of the tightest part of the crevice. They gave him a brief moment to rest before the final pull that would clear him of the drop entirely. And then, the unthinkable happened. As the men held the tension on the rope, a sudden, violently loud crack echoed through the cavern. The stone archway, where the main climbing anchor had been drilled, was not as solid as they had believed. The rock shattered under the immense pressure. A massive piece of stone broke away, sending a heavy metal carabiner flying through the narrow tunnel like a bullet, striking one of the rescuers in the face and momentarily knocking him unconscious. Without the anchor holding the tension, the rope went completely slack. Instantly, gravity reclaimed its victim. John plummeted backward, sliding headfirst all the way down the steep, slick rock face, dropping entirely back into the exact same impossibly tight wedge where he had started. The impact wedged him even deeper, tighter, and lower than before. The dust settled. The rescuers, battered and shocked in the dim light of their headlamps, scrambled to reorient themselves. They called down into the hole, There was no answer. The drop had forced John so deep into the crevice that his chest was completely compressed. His exhausted heart, which had been fighting against gravity and lack of oxygen for nearly 24 hours, could not withstand the shock of the fall and the renewed, crushing pressure. A medical professional on the rescue team was eventually able to crawl down and maneuver a stethoscope through the tiny gap, pressing it as close to John's torso as possible. They listened in the agonizing silence of the cave. There was no heartbeat, no sound of breathing. Sometime in the late hours of November 25th, John Edward Jones had quietly passed away. The devastating news was relayed to the surface. The massive rescue operation, involving over 100 dedicated individuals, ground to a heartbreaking halt. The focus shifted from rescue to recovery, but they quickly realized the grim truth. It was too dangerous to retrieve his body. The rock was too hard, the space too tight, and the risk to the recovery team was simply too great. In the days following the tragedy, an agreement was reached between the Jones family, the landowners, and the local authorities. Nutty Putty Cave would be permanently sealed. They poured concrete into the entrance, locking away the dark, twisting tunnels forever. The cave was transformed from a site of weekend exploration into a permanent, silent tomb for John. This tragic event leaves a heavy, lingering silence in its wake. It stands as a profound reminder of the delicate fragility of human life and the irreversible nature of certain choices. Sometimes, driven by ambition, curiosity, or the simple belief that pushing harder will eventually lead to a breakthrough, we force ourselves into spaces we were never meant to occupy. We push forward into the dark, convinced the path will open up, only to realize too late that the walls have closed in behind us. True wisdom often lies not in the relentless drive to push forward at all costs, but in having the patience and humility to recognize our limits, to know when to stop, and to understand that some paths, once taken, offer no way back. Thank you for joining me on this descent into the dark. If this chilling reality left a heavy weight on your chest, just wait until you hear the entirely different kind of nightmare we have prepared for you next time. Until then, stay safe and always be mindful of where your curiosity leads you. There is a specific kind of terror that belongs only to the deep woods in the dead of winter. It is a quiet, suffocating kind of fear. When the sun drops behind the trees and the temperature plummets, the landscape changes from a peaceful escape into a merciless trap. If you make a mistake out there, the elements do not care about your intentions. They do not care if you are a good person. They only demand that you survive. But what happens when 5 young men, who have no business being in the mountains, abandon a perfectly working vehicle in the middle of a snowy road and willingly walk into the pitch-black, freezing wilderness? Before we dive into that, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. It was Friday, February 24th, 1978. In the quiet, close-knit communities of Yuba City and Marysville, California, 5 young men were buzzing with excitement. They were Ted Viher, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, and Gary Mathias. Ranging in age from 24 to 32, these men were inseparable friends. They all lived at home with their parents, and they all shared a profound, innocent love for the game of basketball. They played on a local team called the Gateway Gators, a team sponsored by a local vocational program. The very next day, Saturday, they were scheduled to play their first game in a week-long tournament. The winner of the tournament would get a free week in Los Angeles, a prize that felt like an absolute dream to these 5 men. They had laid out their uniforms on their beds. They had asked their parents to wake them up early. They were ready. But on that Friday night, they wanted to watch a college basketball game. UC Davis was playing against Chico State. Jack Madruga owned a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego, a car he treated like his most prized possession. He would never let anyone else drive it, and he kept it in pristine condition. Around evening time, the five friends piled into Jack's car and drove south from Yuba City to Davis, California, a drive of about 50 miles. The game was everything they hoped for. It was loud, thrilling, and full of energy. When the final buzzer sounded around 10 p.m., the group left the gymnasium and got back into the Mercury Montego. They drove a short distance to a local convenience store in downtown Chico. The clerk working that night remembered them clearly. They were loud, happy, and polite. They bought some Hostess cherry pies, lemon pies, chocolate bars, and a few cartons of soda. The receipt showed it was slightly after 10:30 p.m. They got back into the car. All they had to do was drive straight south, down the familiar highway, back to their warm beds in Yuba City to rest for their big game the next morning. But they never made it home. When Saturday morning arrived, the parents of the five men woke up to find their sons' empty beds. The uniforms they had laid out the night before were untouched. Panic set in immediately. These were not men who stayed out all night, drinking or partying. Some of them had mild intellectual conditions, and Gary Mathias managed a treatable psychiatric condition. They relied heavily on the structure of their homes and the comfort of their families. For all five of them to vanish without a word was completely out of character. The families started calling each other, realizing that none of the boys had returned. They immediately contacted the local authorities. If this were happening today, someone might have dialed 911 the moment they felt something was wrong. But back then, they frantically dialed the local police station to report them missing. The police initiated a search, retracing the route from Davis back to Yuba City. They checked the highways, the ditches, and the local hospitals. They found absolutely nothing. Days ticked by. Sunday passed. Monday passed. The community was paralyzed with worry. Then, on Tuesday, February 28th, a breakthrough happened, but it only deepened the mystery. A forest ranger was driving up a remote, treacherous dirt road in the Bois National Forest. This road was roughly 70 miles away from Chico, and it was in the complete opposite direction of Yuba City. It went high up into the mountains, far away from any major highway or town. The road was unpaved, deeply rutted, and covered in snow. As the ranger navigated a steep, winding curve, he spotted a turquoise and white Mercury Montego abandoned on the side of the road. It was Jack Madruga's car. The police rushed to the scene, expecting the worst. But when they examined the vehicle, the situation made absolutely no sense. The car was sitting in a few inches of snow, slightly off the main ruts of the road. There were no dents, no scratches, and no signs of a struggle. The gas tank was a quarter full. When a mechanic eventually checked the engine, he found that the car started up immediately. It ran perfectly. Even stranger, the tires were not stuck. 5 grown men could have easily pushed the car back onto the firm gravel with a few minutes of effort. Inside the car, police found the wrappers from the snacks the boys had bought at the convenience store. They found neatly folded maps in the glove compartment. The keys were missing, which suggested Jack had locked up his beloved car, but one of the windows was rolled down, letting the freezing winter air blow into the cabin. The most terrifying realization for the police was the location. The Bois National Forest in February is an unforgiving place. The elevation is high, and the temperatures at night drop well below freezing. The 5 men were not dressed for the mountains. They were wearing light jackets, sneakers, and casual clothes. Why would they drive 70 miles out of their way, up a terrifying pitch-black mountain road, only to abandon a perfectly functioning car that could have served as a warm shelter? Why did they walk into the dark, freezing woods instead of simply turning the car around or sleeping inside until morning? The search and rescue teams scoured the woods surrounding the car. They brought in tracking dogs, helicopters, and men on horseback, but a severe winter storm moved into the mountains shortly after the car was found, dumping several feet of fresh snow over the entire area. The dogs lost the scent. The helicopters could not see through the dense canopy of trees and the blinding snow. The search had to be called off. The families were left in an agonizing limbo, wondering if their sons were freezing somewhere in the dark, calling out for help that would never come. As the investigation continued, a man named Joseph Shawns came forward with a story that sent chills down the spines of the detectives. Joseph told police that on the exact night the boys went missing, he had driven up that same mountain road to check on a cabin he owned. Around 5:30 p.m., his car had gotten deeply stuck in the snow just a short distance past where Jack's Mercury Montego was eventually found. Joseph tried to push his car out, but while doing so, he experienced severe chest pains. Believing he was having a heart attack, he crawled back into his car, turned on the heater, and lay there in agony, hoping someone would drive by. Hours passed. It was incredibly dark and eerily quiet. Then, around 11:30 p.m., Joseph saw headlights coming up the road behind him. He looked out his window and saw a car park roughly 50 yards away. It was a turquoise and white car. He saw a group of people get out. They were standing around the car, talking. Desperate for help, Joseph opened his door and called out to them. He yelled that he was having a heart attack and needed assistance. What happened next makes the blood run cold. The moment Joseph called out, the voices completely stopped. The people standing around the car instantly went silent. A moment later, the headlights of the turquoise car were turned off. The silence of the mountain returned, heavier and more menacing than before. Joseph lay there in the dark, terrified and confused. Why would they ignore a man pleading for help? Why would they turn off their lights and hide? A few hours later, Joseph claimed he saw flashlights moving in the trees, and he called out again. Once again, the flashlights immediately clicked off, and the woods went dead silent. Eventually, Joseph's car ran out of gas. By some miracle, he survived the night and managed to walk 8 miles down the mountain the next morning, until he found a lodge where someone helped him. He never saw the boys again. If Joseph's story was true, it implied that the 5 men were terrified of something. They were hiding. But hiding from what? Or who? Months went by. The brutal winter slowly gave way to spring, and the thick layers of snow in the Bois National Forest finally began to melt. In early June, a group of motorcyclists were riding on a remote trail deep in the mountains, about 19 miles uphill from where the Mercury Montego had been abandoned. They came across an old, heavily weathered Forest Service trailer. It was a shelter used by rangers during the summer months. As the motorcyclists approached, they noticed a pungent, unmistakable smell radiating from the trailer. One of the front windows had been broken. A motorcyclist stepped up, peered through the shattered glass, and immediately backed away in horror. Inside the trailer was a bed. On the bed lay a body wrapped tightly from head to toe in 8 heavy blankets. Police were called to the scene. When they unwrapped the blankets, they identified the body as Ted Wire. The scene inside the trailer was one of the most baffling and heartbreaking things the seasoned detectives had ever witnessed. Ted had not died of unnatural trauma. He had starved to death, and he was suffering from severe frostbite. His feet were badly damaged by the cold. Judging by the growth of his beard and his drastic weight loss, the coroner determined that Ted had lived inside that trailer for anywhere from 8 to 13 weeks before finally passing away. He had suffered in that freezing, dark box for months. But the tragedy of his death was overshadowed by the baffling environment around him. The trailer was stocked with survival supplies. There were heavy winter coats, boots, and warm clothing folded neatly on shelves. None of them had been worn. There was a propane tank outside, connected to a heater inside the trailer. All Ted had to do was turn a valve to have a heated room. The valve was never turned. Most disturbing of all, there was a storage locker inside the trailer that contained enough freeze-dried food and military rations to keep all 5 men alive and fully fed for a year. The locker was sitting right next to the bed where Ted died. A few cans of food had been opened and consumed, apparently using an army surplus can opener that belonged to Gary Mathias. But the vast majority of the food was completely untouched. Ted had literally starved to death while sleeping next to a mountain of food, and frozen to death while surrounded by fuel, fire starters, and heavy coats. Why didn't he eat? Why didn't he turn on the heat? The strange clues did not stop there. Sitting neatly on a table inside the trailer were Ted's leather shoes, his wallet with cash still inside, a gold ring, and a gold necklace. And near the door, investigators found a pair of sneakers. They belonged to Gary Mathias. This meant Gary had been inside the trailer with Ted. He had taken off his sneakers and, presumably, put on a pair of heavy boots from the trailer's supply before leaving. But where did he go? Why did he leave his friend behind? The search teams intensified their efforts in the woods surrounding the trailer. What they found only added to the nightmare. The remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were found roughly halfway between the abandoned car and the trailer. They were located on opposite sides of the logging road. Based on the condition of their remains, investigators deduced that they had succumbed to the freezing temperatures on the very first night. They had literally frozen to death while trying to walk the 19 miles up the mountain. A few days later, a searcher found a skull and some clothing scattered near a thicket of bushes not far from the trailer. Dental records confirmed it was Jack Hewitt. But Gary Mathias was never found. His sneakers inside the trailer were the last trace he ever left on this earth. Extensive searches covering miles of dense forest yielded absolutely nothing. No clothing, no bones, no clues. He had simply vanished into the vast, indifferent wilderness. The investigation slowly ground to a halt. There was no evidence of foul play, no sign of an attacker, and no logical explanation for anything that had happened. The authorities theorized that the men had somehow taken a wrong turn in Chico, gotten lost, and ended up on the mountain road. Perhaps they hit a snowbank, panicked in the dark, and believed the car was permanently stuck. When they saw Joseph Shawns calling for help, perhaps they thought he was a threat, or they were simply too frightened by the strange situation to respond. They abandoned the safety of their car and started walking. But why walk uphill? Why walk deeper into the freezing forest instead of downhill toward the safety of the valley? The prevailing theory is that they saw the distant lights of a Forest Service cabin, or thought they were on a different road altogether. As they trudged through the deep snow in their light clothing, the brutal cold began to take its toll. Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling fell behind and quietly passed away in the snow. The remaining 3, Gary, Ted, and Jack Hewitt, managed to reach the Forest Service trailer 19 miles away. Once inside, they broke a window to get in. In the pitch-black darkness, terrified and freezing, their logic completely broke down. They did not realize how much food was in the locker. They were too scared to touch the propane valve, perhaps fearing an explosion. Ted's feet were so badly frostbitten that he could not walk. Gary and Jack Hewitt stayed with him for a while, opening a few cans of food to keep him alive. But eventually, as weeks dragged on and Ted grew weaker, Gary and Jack Hewitt realized they had to go get help. They left the trailer. Jack Hewitt did not make it far before the elements claimed his life. Gary Mathias took a different path, perhaps trying to find a road or a town, and walked deep into the unknown until he, too, was swallowed by the forest. Ted, unable to move, waited in the dark trailer for his friends to return. He waited for weeks. He waited until his body simply could not endure any more pain, and he quietly passed away, entirely alone. This story leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It is a stark reminder of the fragile line between safety and disaster. It shows how a single, unexplainable decision, taking a wrong turn on a dark night, can lead to irreversible consequences. The universe does not offer second chances to those who wander into its harshest domains. It is completely indifferent to our innocence, our hopes, and our fears. For the families of the 5 men, the pain of not knowing the exact truth was a burden they carried for the rest of their lives. They had to live with the agonizing reality that their sons suffered in the cold, calling out for families who could not hear them. It teaches us a grim lesson about the limits of our control. We can plan our lives, lay out our clothes for tomorrow, and dream about the future. But sometimes, despite our best intentions and our purest hearts, the dark unknown reaches out and pulls us away, leaving nothing behind but questions that will never be answered. The American Dyatlov Pass remains one of the most baffling and heartbreaking mysteries in modern history. The woods up in the Plumas National Forest still hold their secrets, buried under decades of snow and silence. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves a seemingly normal house in a quiet neighborhood and a hidden room that contained a secret so dark, the police officers who found it immediately requested counseling. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. There is an unspoken agreement we all silently accept when we walk through the automatic sliding doors of a modern hospital. We believe that no matter how chaotic, dangerous, or unpredictable the outside world gets, the emergency room is a sanctuary. It is a fortress built entirely on science, reason, and sterile protocols. If you are bleeding, they have the tools to stop it. If your heart stops beating, they have the technology and the training to restart it. The doctors and nurses in those brightly lit corridors are our protectors. They stand between us and the absolute worst moments of our lives. But what happens when the threat does not come from a bullet wound, a car crash, or a known infection? What happens when the patient you are desperately trying to save suddenly becomes a lethal, impossible biohazard, capable of taking down an entire room of highly trained medical professionals in a matter of seconds? Before we get into this terrifying true medical anomaly, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. The city of Riverside, California, in the early months of 1994, was a typical, bustling, suburban hub. The weather in February is usually mild, carrying a slight chill in the evening air that forces people to pull their jackets a little tighter. On the evening of Sunday, February 19th, 1994, the atmosphere inside the emergency room at Riverside General Hospital was steady. It was the kind of busy that seasoned medical staff are completely comfortable with. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant quiet tune. The smell of antiseptic floor cleaner hung heavily in the air. Among the staff on duty that night were people who had dedicated their lives to pulling strangers back from the brink of death. There was an attending physician named Dr. Humberto Ochoa, a man who had seen nearly every trauma imaginable. There was a registered nurse named Susan Kane, known for her steady hands and calm demeanor under intense pressure. And there was a senior medical resident named Julie Gorczynski, a brilliant young doctor who was deeply passionate about emergency medicine. They were a well-oiled machine. They were trained to handle absolute panic with clinical detachment. They were not, however, trained to handle the impossible. Just a few miles away from the bright lights of the hospital, a 31-year-old woman named Gloria Ramirez was living through a nightmare. Gloria was a mother, known to her friends and family as a kind and deeply loving person. But life had recently dealt her an incredibly cruel hand. She had been diagnosed with late-stage cervical cancer. The illness had ravaged her body, bringing with it an immense, unrelenting physical pain that shadowed her every waking moment. Despite the treatments and the brave face she put on for her children, her condition was rapidly deteriorating. Earlier that Sunday evening, Gloria began to experience severe distress. She was sitting in her home when a sudden wave of nausea and shortness of breath overtook her. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She became deeply confused, her sentences slurring together as she tried to communicate with her terrified family. Realizing that something was catastrophically wrong, they rushed to the phone and dialed 911. The paramedics arrived quickly. They found Gloria in a state of severe cardiovascular distress. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and her pulse was racing at a dangerous speed. They immediately loaded her into the back of the ambulance, strapped an oxygen mask over her face to flood her starving lungs with pure oxygen, and began the frantic drive to Riverside General Hospital. At exactly 8:15 p.m., the heavy double doors of the emergency bay burst open. The paramedics rushed the gurney down the hallway, shouting out Gloria's plunging vital signs. The medical team was waiting for them. They immediately directed the gurney into Trauma Room 1, a small enclosed space packed with life-saving equipment. The team swarmed the bed. Dr. Ochoa took command, barking out rapid-fire orders. They needed to stabilize her, and they needed to do it immediately. They quickly injected her with fast-acting sedatives and cardiac drugs designed to slow down a heart that was beating so fast it was failing to pump blood. They pushed Valium and Ativan into her veins. Nothing worked. Her heart rate continued to climb, vibrating in her chest rather than beating. Her lungs were failing. Realizing that she was on the absolute edge of a total collapse, Dr. Ochoa ordered the team to prepare the defibrillator. They needed to deliver a massive electric shock to her chest to reset her heart rhythm. As the nurses moved in to remove Gloria's shirt and place the adhesive defibrillator pads on her chest, a strange, collective pause settled over Trauma Room 1. The medical staff noticed something bizarre. Gloria's skin was covered in an unusual, thick, oily sheen. It did not look like the cold sweat of a dying patient. It looked like a thin layer of grease shining under the harsh overhead lights. At the exact same moment, an incredibly potent and bizarre odor began to fill the small room. It was a sharp, pungent, deeply chemical smell. Some of the nurses later described it as smelling like heavy garlic. Others said it smelled like a mix of ammonia and rotting fruit. It was a smell that made the back of the throat burn. It was a smell that simply did not belong in a sterile, carefully controlled hospital environment. But a patient was slipping away on the table. They could not stop to investigate a strange odor. They had to keep moving. Dr. Ochoa gave the order to draw blood. They needed immediate lab results to figure out what was destroying her organs. Nurse Susan Kane grabbed a fresh syringe, expertly found a vein in Gloria's arm, inserted the needle, and slowly pulled back the plunger. She watched as the dark red blood filled the plastic tube. Susan pulled the vial away, intending to hand it off to a technician. But as she looked at the tube, she froze. She held the vial up to the bright fluorescent lights. Floating inside the dark red liquid were tiny, solid, manila-colored particles. They looked like little crystals. Susan stared at it in complete disbelief. Blood does not crystallize inside the veins of a living human being. It was medically impossible. She leaned in slightly, bringing the vial closer to her face to inspect the bizarre phenomenon. As she did, she caught a direct whiff of the air escaping from the tiny hole at the top of the syringe. Instantly, Susan's face lost all its color. She stumbled backward, bumping hard into a stainless steel medical cart. She gasped, telling her colleagues that her face was burning and that the room was violently spinning. Before anyone could reach out to catch her, Susan's eyes rolled back, and she collapsed heavily onto the linoleum floor, completely unconscious. The room erupted. One of the other nurses quickly grabbed Susan by the shoulders and dragged her out of Trauma Room 1, shouting for help. In the chaos, the vial of crystallized blood was handed to the senior resident, Julie Gorkinski. Julie took the warm plastic tube. She looked at the impossible manila crystals floating inside. She too leaned her head down to smell the syringe, trying to identify the chemical odor that was now suffocating the room. A wave of intense, crushing nausea hit Julie like a physical blow. She felt a massive weight pressed down on her chest. The bright lights of the trauma room smeared into blinding streaks. She knew she was about to pass out. She managed to hand the vial to another staff member and staggered out of the room, heading frantically toward the main nurse's station to sit down. She grabbed onto a wooden desk for support, but her legs completely gave out beneath her. Julie collapsed. When her colleagues rushed to her side, they were horrified to see that she was not just unconscious. She was actively seizing. Her body convulsed violently on the hospital floor. Her breathing was shallow, and her eyes were fixed. Back inside Trauma Room 1, the nightmare was compounding. A respiratory therapist named Maureen Welch was standing at the head of the bed, manually pumping a bag valve mask to force air into Gloria's failing lungs. Maureen felt a sudden, terrifying wave of dizziness wash over her entire body. Her arms grew heavy. The beeping monitors faded into a distant echo. She let go of the mask, took 2 unsteady steps away from the bed, and collapsed face first onto the floor. Within a span of just a few minutes, 3 highly trained medical professionals had dropped to the ground, completely incapacitated by an invisible force radiating from the dying woman on the table. The emergency room descended into pure, unadulterated terror. The staff realized that whatever was killing Gloria Ramirez was now airborne, and it was taking them down one by one. The hospital administration was immediately notified. A code was called over the loudspeakers. The order was given to evacuate the entire emergency department. It was a scene of absolute pandemonium. Dozens of patients, some sitting in wheelchairs with broken bones, some bleeding from lacerations, were rushed out of their rooms and wheeled outside into the cold night air of the hospital parking lot. The nurses and doctors set up a makeshift triage center under the dim orange glow of the streetlights. They worked frantically to keep their existing patients alive, while simultaneously fleeing the invisible poison that had taken over their building. But inside Trauma Room 1, a small skeleton crew made the ultimate, terrifying sacrifice. Dr. Ochoa and a few brave nurses refused to abandon Gloria. They stayed inside the contaminated zone. They fought a losing battle against her failing heart. They charged the defibrillator and shocked her again and again. They pumped every resuscitation drug they had in the crash cart into her system. They worked in a room that felt like it was actively trying to kill them, taking shallow breaths, fighting through their own dizziness, burning eyes, and overwhelming nausea. Despite their heroic and terrifying efforts, the damage to Gloria's body was too severe. At 8:50 p.m., Dr. Ochoa stepped back from the bed, looked at the flat line on the monitor, and pronounced Gloria Ramirez dead. The medical staff stepped away from her body, exhausted, traumatized, and terrified for their own lives. They carefully stripped off their scrubs, sealed them in hazardous waste bags, and thoroughly scrubbed themselves down in the emergency decontamination showers. The entire emergency room was sealed off behind thick plastic sheeting. The local police arrived, followed quickly by the fire department, and eventually, a specialized hazardous materials team, dressed from head to toe in full containment suits. The hazmat team slowly entered the empty, silent hospital wing. They carried highly sensitive equipment designed to detect radiation, poisonous gas leaks, and chemical weapons. They slowly swept the hallways. They tested the air in Trauma Room 1. They tested the surfaces, the medical equipment, and the ventilation system. They found absolutely nothing. There were no toxic chemicals detected. The hospital was completely baffled. Over the next few days, the investigation widened. The county health department stepped in. When the coroner performed the autopsy on Gloria's body, the level of fear was so high that he and his team had to wear custom-made, fully enclosed aluminum protective suits with their own independent oxygen supplies. They performed the procedure inside a specially built, airtight containment chamber. They took tissue samples, blood samples, and tested her organs for every known toxin. Again, they found no evidence of known poisonous gases. no agricultural pesticides, and no radioactive materials. For a brief, insulting moment, the official ruling from the health department was mass hysteria. The officials suggested that the intense stress of working in the emergency room, combined with a strange but harmless smell, caused the staff to experience a localized psychological breakdown. They claimed the fainting was entirely in their heads. The medical staff was furious. You do not seize from a panic attack. More importantly, Julie Gorchinsky, the resident who had handled the blood, spent 2 agonizing weeks in the intensive care unit. She developed severe internal complications. She developed a rare bone condition known as avascular necrosis, which literally caused the bone tissue in her knees to physically die and rot away due to a lack of blood supply. She required months of grueling physical therapy and multiple surgeries just to walk again. A psychological panic attack does not cause human bones to die. Something physical, something incredibly dangerous, had entered their bodies that night. Months later, a complex and terrifying chemical theory finally emerged. It was pieced together by a team of elite scientists at a national laboratory who spent weeks running computer simulations and chemical tests. The theory they proposed suggested a chain of events so unlikely it seemed like dark magic. Gloria was suffering from immense, unending pain due to her advanced cancer. It is highly believed that in her desperation for relief, she may have been using a common home remedy solvent called dimethyl sulfoxide, or DMSO, rubbing it directly onto her skin. This solvent is known to be a powerful pain reliever for muscles and joints. It also has a distinct garlic-like odor, and it leaves a thick, oily residue on the skin. This perfectly explained the strange smell and the sheen the nurses noticed when they removed her shirt. But DMSO by itself is not toxic. The deadly transformation happened because of the medical interventions. When the paramedics strapped the oxygen mask to Gloria's face in the ambulance, the intense saturation of pure oxygen in her blood reacted with the DMSO in her system. The oxygen molecules bonded with the solvent, creating a new chemical compound called dimethyl sulfone. Dimethyl sulfone is known to crystallize at room temperature. This perfectly explained the bizarre manila-colored particles Susan Kane saw floating in the blood tube when it hit the cool air of the emergency room. But even dimethyl sulfone is not a deadly poison. The final fatal catalyst happened in Trauma Room 1. When Dr. Ochoa ordered the team to use the defibrillator, the powerful electric shock delivered to Gloria's chest shot through her body and hit the newly formed chemical in her bloodstream. The intense electrical energy rearranged the molecules one last time. It converted the dimethyl sulfone into dimethyl sulfate. Dimethyl sulfate is an extraordinarily deadly, heavy, invisible poison gas. It is a blistering agent that destroys human tissue on contact. When Susan Kane drew the blood, that deadly gas bubbled out of the liquid. It entered the air of the small, poorly ventilated room, and it instantly poisoned the medical staff who inhaled it. This story leaves a heavy, lingering weight on the mind. It is a stark and terrifying exploration of the unpredictable nature of our world. It speaks to the lengths a person will go to find relief from unbearable suffering, reaching for any remedy that might offer just a moment of peace. But more profoundly, it reveals how incredibly fragile the boundaries of our safety really are. We build massive fortresses of science and medicine. We believe we can control the variables of life and death with machines and protocols. Yet, a simple sequence of well-intentioned actions seeking comfort, applying oxygen to help someone breathe, trying to restart a failing heart, can accidentally summon a nightmare. It teaches us a grim lesson about the hidden consequences of our actions. It shows us that every choice we make carries unseen ripples, and sometimes the very things meant to save us are the exact things that seal our fate. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves an abandoned town in the middle of the American Rust Belt where the ground has been burning for decades, and a group of urban explorers who discovered that the toxic smoke is not the only thing rising from the cracked earth. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. There is a very specific type of terror that comes from something that simply cannot happen. We are accustomed to tragedy, and we can process violence or accidents because they leave evidence behind. They leave a trail of cause and effect that our brains can understand. But what happens when the physical laws of our reality just seem to break? Imagine a room with only one door. You set up a camera pointing directly at that door. You watch a person walk through that door into the room. A few minutes later, you watch every single person inside that room walk back out. But the person you watched go in is not among them. You search the room, and it is completely empty. Where did they go? Did they dissolve into the air? Did they step into a crack in the universe? Ah. This is not a thought experiment. This is exactly what happened to a young man in Ohio, in a case that remains one of the most baffling, logically impossible mysteries ever recorded. Before we dive into the impossible vanishing of this young man, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place. I upload stories just like this regularly, so please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. The year was 2006. The city was Columbus, Ohio. Brian Schaefer was 27 years old, and on the surface, his life was moving in a brilliant direction. He was a second-year medical student at Ohio State University, a bright, handsome, and deeply intelligent young man with a promising future as a doctor. He had a beautiful girlfriend named Alexis, who was also a medical student, and they were deeply in love. In fact, Brian had recently purchased a ring and was planning to ask Alexis to marry him during an upcoming vacation they had booked to Miami, Florida. They were scheduled to fly out on a Monday, just a few days away. But underneath the surface of this perfect life, Brian was carrying a heavy, suffocating weight. Just 3 weeks prior to this story, Brian had lost his mother to a grueling battle with cancer. He had been incredibly close to her, and her death had left a massive, hollow void in his heart. He was trying to hold it together, pushing through his grueling medical exams and keeping a brave face for his family and Alexis. But the grief was a constant, heavy shadow following him everywhere. On Friday, March 31st, 2006, Brian finished his final medical exams for the quarter. It was the beginning of spring break. He and his father went out to dinner that evening. His father noticed that Brian looked exhausted. The late nights of studying, combined with the raw, unprocessed grief of losing his mother, were clearly taking a toll on him. His father told him he should just go home, get some rest, and pack for his trip to Miami. But Brian declined. He said he was going to meet up with his friend and fellow medical student, Clint, to celebrate the end of their exams. He needed a distraction. He needed to blow off some steam. Around 9 p.m., Brian met up with Clint at a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloon. This location is absolutely crucial to understanding the sheer impossibility of what was about to happen. The Ugly Tuna Saloon was located inside a large entertainment complex in the University District, but the bar was not on the ground floor. It was located on the second floor of the building. To get into the bar, you had to walk into the ground floor lobby and ride a long escalator up to the second level. At the top of the escalator, there was a small landing and then the main entrance doors leading into the bar. Most importantly, the building was equipped with security cameras. There was a camera mounted on the ceiling right outside the Ugly Tuna Saloon. This camera continuously panned back and forth, capturing the top of the escalator, the landing, and the front doors of the bar. It was the only public entrance and the only public exit. If you went into the bar, you were caught on that camera. If you left the bar, you were caught on that camera. Brian and Clint started their night at the Ugly Tuna. They had a few drinks, catching up and enjoying the loud, energetic atmosphere of the college crowd. After a while, they decided to do some bar hopping. They left the Ugly Tuna, went back down the escalator, and visited a few other establishments in the immediate area. They drank, they talked to friends, and they tried to drown out the heavy stress of the past few weeks. As the night wore on, they met up with a female friend named Meredith. The three of them continued their night out, eventually deciding to head back to where they started. At 1:15 a.m., early Saturday morning on April 1st, the security camera at the Ugly Tuna Saloon captured Brian, Clint, and Meredith riding the escalator back up to the second floor. The footage shows them clearly. They step off the escalator, walk across the landing, and disappear through the doors into the crowded bar. The bar was incredibly packed. The music was deafening, the air was hot and humid from hundreds of bodies pressing together, and the drinks were flowing. Clint and Meredith found a spot near the bar, but Brian told them he was going to walk around and see if he could find some other friends. He wandered off into the dense crowd, disappearing into the sea of people. Time slipped away. At 1:55 a.m., just 5 minutes before the bar was scheduled to close for the night, the security camera outside the entrance captured Brian once again. The footage shows Brian stepping out of the front doors of the bar. He walks onto the landing near the top of the escalator. He is talking to two young women. They stand there for a brief moment, chatting. Brian looks totally normal. He is not stumbling. He does not look distressed, and he does not seem to be in any kind of danger. He says goodbye to the two women. The women turn and walk toward the escalator to leave the building. Brian, however, does not follow them. The camera clearly shows him turn around, face the entrance of the Ugly Tuna Saloon, and walk back toward the doors. He steps out of the frame, heading directly back into the bar. At 2 a.m., the harsh, bright, overhead lights of the Ugly Tuna Saloon turned on. The music abruptly cut off. The bartenders started shouting for everyone to finish their drinks and head toward the exit. It was closing time. Clint and Meredith were standing near the front, waiting for Brian. As the massive crowd began to funnel out of the doors and down the escalator, they kept their eyes peeled for their friend. They watched hundreds of college students shuffle past them. The crowd slowly thinned out until the bar was completely empty. The staff began wiping down the tables and sweeping the floors, but Brian never came out. Clint and Meredith checked the bathrooms. They were empty. They walked around the entire second-floor landing. Nothing. Clint tried calling Brian's cell phone multiple times, but it went straight to voicemail. Frustrated and assuming that Brian had perhaps met up with someone else and left without telling them, or simply decided to walk home to his apartment, Clint and Meredith gave up. They walked down the escalator and went home. Saturday morning arrived. Alexis, Brian's girlfriend, called him several times, eager to talk about their trip to Miami. Her calls went directly to voicemail. She thought it was slightly strange, but she figured he was just sleeping off a heavy night of drinking. As the day progressed into evening, and Brian still had not returned any calls from Alexis, Clint, or his father, a cold sense of unease began to settle over the family. Brian was not the type of person to completely ignore his phone, especially not with a major trip coming up. By Sunday, the unease had turned into pure panic. Brian had a flight to catch on Monday morning. He had not been home. His car was still parked at his apartment. His luggage was not packed. Monday morning came. Alexis stood at the airport departure gate in absolute agony, watching the passengers board the flight to Miami. She waited until the very last second, praying she would see Brian running down the terminal. But he never showed up. The plane doors closed, and the plane took off without him. At that exact moment, Alexis knew something was horribly wrong. The family immediately contacted the Columbus police and officially reported Brian Schaefer missing. The police launched an investigation, initially assuming this was a standard case of a young man who had perhaps wandered off and gotten into an accident. They requested the security footage from the Ugly Tuna Saloon, focusing entirely on the night of Friday, March 31st, and the early hours of Saturday, April 1st. The detectives sat in a dark room. Watching the grainy footage, they saw Brian, Clint, and Meredith ride the escalator up at 1:15 a.m. They fast-forwarded. They watched the footage at 1:55 a.m. They saw Brian walk out, talk to the two women, turn around, and walk back toward the bar entrance. Then, the detectives watched the footage from 2 a.m. until the bar was completely empty. They watched every single person walk out of those doors and go down the escalator. They paused the tape, they rewound it, they watched it again. They focused on every face, every jacket, every gate. Brian Schaffer never walked out. The detectives were baffled. They thought they must have missed something. They implemented a painstaking manual counting process. They counted every single person who went up the escalator that night. Then, they counted every single person who came down the escalator. The numbers did not lie. Every single person who went up that night came back down, except for one, Brian. How does a 27-year-old man vanish from a second-floor bar with only one public exit? The police immediately secured the building. They brought in highly trained search dogs. The dogs were given a piece of Brian's unwashed clothing to pick up his scent. The dogs tracked his scent through the ground floor lobby, up the escalator, across the landing, and into the Ugly Tuna Saloon. The dogs wandered around the bar floor, following his path through the crowd. But then, the scent just stopped. The dogs spun in circles, confused. They could not find a trail leading out. It was as if Brian had evaporated into thin air right there on the bar floor. The authorities began to look for alternative exits. If he did not go down the escalator, he had to have left through another door. The only other way out of the Ugly Tuna Saloon was a set of emergency service doors located in the back of the building. These doors were strictly for staff and deliveries. The police investigated the service doors. If Brian had somehow slipped through them without anyone noticing, he would have found himself in a chaotic, highly dangerous environment. The back of the building was a massive, active construction site. It was dark, filled with deep trenches, exposed rebar, concrete pillars, and steep drops. It was a labyrinth of scaffolding and debris. But there was a major problem with this theory. The service doors were not meant for public use. They were heavy, and they opened up to a route that was notoriously difficult to navigate even in the daylight. More importantly, the construction site was heavily monitored by motion-sensitive security cameras to prevent theft. The police pulled every single hour of footage from the construction site cameras for that entire weekend. They watched the tapes, looking for any sign of movement, any shadow, any sign of a person stumbling through the dark. The motion sensors were never tripped. The cameras captured absolutely nothing. Furthermore, police scoured the entire construction zone. They brought the tracking dogs through the debris. They looked down every trench and inside every concrete pipe. They found zero physical evidence that anyone had been there. There was no blood, no torn clothing, no footprints in the mud. The situation was entirely impossible. He did not leave through the front. He did not leave through the back. He was not inside the bar. Desperation set in. Prevent. The police theorized that perhaps Brian had changed his clothes to disguise himself and slipped past the front camera. They meticulously interviewed every single person who was in the bar that night. They tracked down the two women he was seen speaking to at 1:55 a.m. The women confirmed they spoke to him briefly, said goodbye, and left. They had no idea where he went afterward. They checked Brian's bank accounts, his credit cards, and his cell phone records. After the night he vanished, his phone never pinged another cell tower. His credit cards were never swiped. His bank accounts remained completely untouched. He had simply ceased to exist. Weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. The disappearance of Brian Schaffer became a national obsession. It is the ultimate locked room mystery playing out in real life. People analyzed the footage frame by frame, suggesting wild theories. Some believed that Brian, overwhelmed by the grief of losing his mother and the pressure of medical school, had meticulously planned his own disappearance, finding an unseen blind spot in the camera system to escape and start a new life. But his family entirely rejected this. Brian loved Alexis. He was about to propose. He loved his father and his brother. He would never inflict that kind of agonizing pain on them, especially so soon after his mother's death. Others believed he met with foul play inside the bar. They suggested that an altercation occurred in the back rooms, and his body was somehow smuggled out in a trash bin or hidden within the walls of the construction site before the concrete was poured. The police brought in ground-penetrating radar to scan the concrete pillars of the new construction, desperate to find an anomaly that might be a human body. The radar found nothing. The ugly tuna saloon eventually closed its doors permanently, but the mystery of what happened inside that building continues to haunt anyone who hears it. This story forces us to confront a very uncomfortable reality about our lives. We spend all our time building foundations. We go to school, we plan vacations, we buy rings for the people we love, and we operate under the absolute assumption that tomorrow is a guaranteed event. We believe that the ground beneath our feet is solid. But life is an incredibly fragile, unpredictable current. The physical world can shift in ways we cannot comprehend. It teaches us a quiet lesson about the sincerity of our connections. We never truly know when the last time we speak to someone will be. We never know when a simple goodbye will become a permanent silence. The grief that Brian's family endured, waiting for a phone call that never came, waiting for a door to open that remained shut forever, is a stark reminder to hold the people we care about close. It is a reminder to live with patience, to express our love sincerely, and to never let a disagreement linger into the night, because the universe does not owe us closure. It does not owe us an explanation. Sometimes, the people we love the most simply step out of the frame, and we are left staring at an empty room for the rest of our lives. If you found this story fascinating, you are going to want to hear the next one. It involves a massive, isolated mountain range where a young boy vanished into thin air, only to be found days later miles away, telling a story about a creature that defies every law of nature. Click the video on the screen right now to watch it. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place, because that is all we do. We upload at least 3 of these stories every single week. So if that is something you are into, please go ahead and invite the like button over for a nice dinner, but then insist on eating in total silence while staring directly at their forehead. Tonight, we are looking at a case that takes place in a small, quiet town in the Pacific Northwest called Oak Haven. It is the kind of place where people move to get away from the noise of Seattle or Portland. It is surrounded by thick, ancient forests that seem to swallow the light, and for most people who live there, the biggest drama is usually a fallen tree or a local deer getting into someone's garden. But for a woman named Sarah Jenkins, Oak Haven was about to become the setting of a mystery that would defy everything she knew about reality. It was 11:45 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday in October 2025. Sarah was sitting in a dimly lit, high-tech room at the Oak Haven Emergency Communications Center. She was a veteran emergency dispatcher, someone who had heard it all. She had talked people through heart attacks, guided fathers through delivering babies in the back of minivans, and calmed down frantic callers during house fires. She was calm, professional, and almost impossible to rattle. The night shift was usually slow. The only sounds in the room were the hum of the cooling fans from the computer towers and the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. Sarah was sipping a lukewarm cup of black coffee, staring at her monitors, waiting for the next call to come in. At exactly midnight, her console lit up. A call was coming through. Sarah adjusted her headset, clicked her mouse to accept the line, and gave her standard greeting. 911. What is your emergency? There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. All Sarah could hear was a faint, static hiss and the sound of heavy, ragged breathing. It sounded like someone was running, or perhaps they were in extreme pain. Hello? This is 911. Do you have an emergency? Sarah repeated. Her voice steady but firm. Finally, a voice came through, but it was not screaming. It was a whisper, a woman's voice, trembling with a level of terror that Sarah had never encountered in her 10 years on the job. You have to help me, the voice said. He is inside. He is coming up the stairs right now. Sarah immediately went into professional mode. Her fingers began flying across the keyboard. Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. What is your address? There was a loud thud on the other end of the line, like a door being kicked in. The caller let out a muffled sob. 142 North Maple Drive, the woman whispered. My name is Sarah Jenkins. Please, he has a knife. He is at the door. Sarah froze. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a second, the entire room seemed to tilt. 142 North Maple Drive was not just a random address, it was her address, and Sarah Jenkins was her name. She looked at the caller ID display on her screen. Usually, it would show a phone number or a GPS coordinate. But tonight, the box for the caller information was blank, except for a timestamp that sat at the very bottom of the metadata. It read, October 29th, 2025, 12:10 a.m. Sarah looked at the clock on her wall. It was currently midnight on October 28th. According to her system, this call was coming from 10 minutes in the future. She felt a cold wave of nausea wash over her. She thought it was a prank, perhaps a coworker playing a cruel joke. But the voice on the other end did not sound like a recording. It sounded exactly like her. The cadence, the slight rasp in the throat, the way she pronounced her S's, it was her own voice, screaming in a future that had not happened yet. Ma'am, who is this? Sarah asked, her voice cracking for the first time in her career. I told you, it is Sarah. He is in the room. I am hiding in the closet, but the door is opening. Oh, God, please. Then a sickening sound came through the headset. It was a wet, tearing noise, followed by a sharp, guttural cry that was cut off abruptly. There was a heavy thud, the sound of something hitting a carpeted floor, and then the line went dead. Sarah sat in total silence. Her breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. She looked around the dispatch center, but the other dispatcher on duty, a man named Dave, was in the break room getting a snack. She was alone. She looked at the clock again. It was 12:02 a.m. She had 8 minutes. Her mind was racing. If that call was real, someone was going to break into her house in 8 minutes and kill her. But she was here, at work. She was safe behind locked doors and security cameras. How could she be at her house and at the dispatch center at the same time? Then she remembered. She was supposed to have stayed home tonight. She had traded shifts with Dave at the last minute because she wanted to finish a project at the office. If she had stayed home, she would be at 142 North Maple Drive right now. She grabbed her cell phone and dialed her home security system. She had cameras in the living room and the hallway. She opened the app, her hand shaking so hard she almost dropped the phone. The feed loaded slowly. The living room was dark and quiet. Everything looked normal. She checked the clock on the camera feed. 12:04 a.m. She began to tell herself that it had to be a prank. Some hacker must have found a way to spoof the 911 system and use an AI voice generator to mimic her. It was the only logical explanation. But as she watched the screen, she saw a shadow move across the back patio. A man was standing outside her glass sliding door. He was wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt and a mask that obscured his face. In his right hand, he held a long, serrated kitchen knife. Sarah's blood turned to ice. This was not a prank. She watched as the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device. He pressed it against the glass, and a second later, the entire sliding door shattered silently. He stepped into her living room. Sarah did not hesitate. She picked up her radio and called for backup. She dispatched every available unit to her own address, reporting a home invasion in progress. She stayed on the line with the officers, her voice returning to that professional, robotic calm that she used to survive the job. "Units are en route, Sarah," Dave said, coming back into the room and seeing the look on her face. "What's going on?" "Someone is in my house," she whispered, pointing at the phone screen. They watched together as the intruder moved through the house with a chilling sense of purpose. He did not look for jewelry or electronics. He went straight for the stairs. He climbed them slowly, one by one. 12:08 a.m. The man reached the top of the stairs and turned toward the master bedroom. He kicked the door open. Sarah watched on her phone as he scanned the empty room. He looked confused. He turned toward the closet, the exact place where the voice on the phone said she was hiding. He ripped the closet door open and lunged inside, swinging the knife. But the closet was empty. Sarah felt a surge of triumph. She had changed the future. Because she had decided to come into work, the timeline had shifted. She was not there to be killed. But then the man in the video stopped. He looked directly at the security camera mounted in the corner of the room. It was as if he knew she was watching him. He reached up, grabbed the camera, and the feed went black. 12:10 a.m. The exact time the call from the future was supposed to have ended. Sarah leaned back in her chair, shaking. Dave put a hand on her shoulder. "The police are there now, Sarah. They'll get him." They waited for the radio to crackle with news of an arrest. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. Finally, the lead officer, a veteran named Sergeant Miller, came over the air. "Sarah, we've cleared the house. All floors are secure." "Did you get him?" Sarah asked, leaning toward the desk. "That's the thing, Sarah," Miller replied, his voice sounding puzzled. "The house is empty. There's no sign of a break-in. The sliding door is perfectly intact. The bedroom door is locked from the inside. We had to force entry, but there is nobody here." Sarah frowned. "But I saw him. I saw him break the glass. I saw him go into my bedroom. I have the recording on my phone." She opened her app to show Dave the recorded footage. But when she clicked on the history for 12 a.m., there was nothing. The log showed that the cameras had been offline for the past hour due to a scheduled firmware update. There was no footage of a man with a knife. There was no broken glass. Sarah felt a cold dread sink into her bones. She went home that night, escorted by 4 police officers. They searched every inch of the property again. They looked under the beds, in the attic, and behind the bushes. Nothing. The house was a fortress. For the next week, Sarah could not sleep. She jumped at every sound. She installed 3 more locks on every door and bought a heavy-duty safe for her bedroom. She became obsessed with the call. She went back into the dispatch archives to find the recording of the 911 call from that night. She found the log entry for 12 midnight, but when she played the audio, there was no voice. There was no screaming. There was only 10 minutes of absolute, dead silence. She began to wonder if she had suffered some kind of mental break. Perhaps the stress of the job had finally caught up to her, and she had hallucinated the entire thing. Her coworkers started looking at her with pity. Dave suggested she take some time off. But Sarah knew what she had heard. She knew the sound of her own voice dying. Months passed, and the memory began to fade, as traumatic memories often do. She started to convince herself that it really was just a strange glitch in the system combined with a panic attack. She went back to her normal routine. It was exactly 1 year later, October 28th, 2026. Sarah was at home. She had the night off. She was sitting in her living room, reading a book, feeling peaceful for the first time in a long time. The rain was drumming against the roof, a familiar, comforting sound in Oak Haven. She looked at the clock on the mantel. It was 11:45 p.m. Suddenly, her cell phone rang. She picked it up off the coffee table. The caller ID was blank. She felt a prickle of fear, but she answered it anyway. "Hello?" There was silence for a few seconds. Then, a voice. It was a woman's voice, calm and professional. 911. "What is your emergency?" Sarah dropped the book. The voice on the phone was her own, but it was not her voice from right now. It was the voice she used when she was at work. It was her dispatcher voice. "Who is this?" Sarah whispered. The voice on the other end continued. "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. What is your address?" Sarah realized with a jolt of horror what was happening. She wasn't the caller this time. She was the one being watched. She looked toward the back of the house. Through the reflection in the dark window, she saw a shadow move across the patio. A man, in a dark, hooded sweatshirt, was standing there. He held a serrated kitchen knife in his right hand. He didn't have a device to break the glass this time. He didn't need one, because Sarah, in her paranoia over the last year, had replaced the glass with a reinforced sliding door that had a specific flaw in the latch that she had forgotten to fix. The man reached out, jiggled the handle, and the door slid open with a smooth, silent hiss. Sarah scrambled off the couch, her heart hammering against her ribs. She realized that the call she had heard a year ago wasn't from 10 minutes in the future. It was from a year in the future. The system hadn't glitched the date, it had glitched the year. She ran for the stairs, her phone still pressed to her ear. She could hear her own voice from a year ago, speaking to her from the dispatch center. "Ma'am, stay calm. Units are en route." But Sarah knew the truth now. The units weren't en route, because a year ago she had sent them to an empty house where nothing was happening. Tonight, because of the false alarm she had triggered back then, the police had flagged her address as a low priority for phantom calls. She reached the top of the stairs and ran into her bedroom. She slammed the door and locked it. She scrambled into the closet, pulling the slatted doors shut behind her. She heard the bedroom door kick open. She heard the heavy footsteps on the carpet. She huddled in the darkness, surrounded by the smell of her own clothes. She whispered into the phone, hoping that somehow her past self could hear the truth. "He is in the room. I am hiding in the closet, but the door is opening. Oh God, please." The closet door was ripped open. The last thing Sarah Jenkins saw was the flash of a serrated blade in the moonlight. In the end, Sarah had spent a whole year trying to outrun a ghost, only to realize that every step she took to protect herself was actually building the trap she would eventually fall into. We often think that by knowing the future, we can change it, but sometimes the map we are given is the very thing that leads us to the end of the road. The Oak Haven police eventually found the man. He was a drifter who had been obsessed with Sarah for years, watching her from the woods, waiting for the perfect moment when she would be most vulnerable. He told the police that the only reason he found the courage to enter the house was because he saw her installing so many locks, and he realized how afraid she truly was. But as for that 911 call, it remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of the department. The recording of the silence still sits in the archives, a 10-minute gap where a woman's life was supposedly saved, only to be taken exactly 365 days later. But that is a story for another time. Imagine walking into a freezing, dark cabin in the middle of an isolated forest. You are shivering uncontrollably, starving and terrified. Right in front of you, stacked neatly on the shelves, is enough food to last an entire year. Just outside the door is a full propane tank connected to a heater inside the room. All you have to do is turn a small valve, strike a single match, or open a can of food. But instead of saving your own life, you just lie down in the freezing dark, pull a blanket up to your chin, and slowly waste away. This is not a hypothetical scenario from a horror movie. This is exactly what happened in one of the most baffling, unsettling, and heartbreaking mysteries in American history. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in a story format, you have come to the right place. Please take a moment to gently tap the like button and subscribe so you never miss out on these unsettling stories. It was the evening of February 24th, 1978. Five best friends from Yuba City, California, were piling into a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego. The air was brisk, but the men were entirely consumed by excitement. These men were Ted Weyer, Gary Mathias, Jack Madruga, Jack Hewitt, and Bill Sterling. They ranged in age from 24 to 32, and they were a very unique group of friends. Each of them had some form of mild cognitive disability or psychiatric condition, but they were high-functioning, held down jobs, lived safely at home with their parents, and shared an intense, unbreakable bond over one single passion. That passion was basketball. They had formed their own team called the Gateway Gators. The very next day, they were scheduled to play their first game in a regional Special Olympics tournament. The stakes were incredibly high in their eyes, as the winning team would get a free week-long trip to Los Angeles. They were so thrilled about the tournament that some of them had already carefully laid out their freshly washed uniforms on their beds before leaving the house that evening. They wanted to be completely ready for the morning. But tonight, they were taking a short road trip. They were driving 50 miles north to the town of Chico to watch a college basketball game. Jack Madruga was behind the wheel. He loved his car fiercely and drove it with extreme, almost overly cautious care. The college game was lively, and the boys had a fantastic time cheering from the bleachers. The game ended around 10 p.m. Afterward, the group stopped at a small local market just down the street from the gymnasium. The store clerk vividly remembered them. They were cheerful and polite, buying Hostess cherry pies, candy bars, and sodas to snack on during the ride back. It was about 10:30 p.m. when they walked out of the brightly lit store, got back into the Mercury Montego, and drove off into the dark California night. They were supposed to head south, taking a straight, easy, and very familiar highway directly back to Yuba City. Their parents expected them to be home safely in their beds by midnight at the absolute latest. But midnight came and went. The house phones remained silent. The boys did not return. By 6 a.m. the next morning, the parents were awake and frantically calling each other's houses. By 8 a.m., the police had been notified. The authorities initially tried to calm the parents down, suggesting the men had simply taken a detour, perhaps deciding to stay over at a friend's house or got a flat tire. But the mothers and fathers knew better. These five men were strict creatures of habit. They never missed a curfew without calling home, and more importantly, they would never, ever risk missing their big basketball tournament that morning. For them to miss the game they had trained months for, something had to be horribly, terribly wrong. Days turned into a week, and a massive search effort across the local highways yielded absolutely nothing. It was as if the turquoise car and the five men had vanished off the face of the earth. Then, a breakthrough happened, but it only deepened the terror. A park ranger reported seeing an abandoned car parked on a remote, unpaved logging road deep inside the Plumas National Forest. The location made absolutely no sense. The car was found 70 miles away from Chico, in the complete opposite direction of Yuba City. It was high up in the mountains, at a freezing elevation of 4,400 feet. The police rushed to the scene immediately. It was indeed Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego. When investigators arrived at the vehicle, the clues they found shattered every logical theory they had. The car was sitting perfectly upright on the snow-covered dirt road. There were no dents, no scratches, and no signs of any kind of accident or struggle. The keys were missing, but when the police hot-wired the ignition, the engine roared to life immediately. The gas tank was a quarter full. The tires were in perfect condition. The car was slightly bogged down in a shallow snowdrift, but 5 grown men could have easily pushed it out in less than a minute. Even more bizarre, the candy wrappers and empty soda cans from the market in Chico were neatly folded and left inside the cabin. But there was no trace of the 5 men. The authorities were completely baffled. Why would Jack Madruga, a man who hated driving on unfamiliar roads and treated his car like a prized possession, drive up a treacherous, winding, unpaved mountain road in the dead of winter? They were far from home, heading into absolute wilderness, wearing clothes meant for a mild California evening indoors. They were dressed in light windbreakers, jeans, and low-top sneakers. The temperature up on that mountain was plummeting toward 0 degrees. And why, when the car got slightly stuck, did they abandon a perfectly working vehicle that could have provided shelter, safety, and a functioning heater? Shortly after the car was found, the police received a deeply disturbing tip. A local man named Joseph Shones came forward with a story that sounded like a nightmare. He told police that on the exact night the men went missing, he was driving his own truck up that very same logging road. He was looking for the snow line because he wanted to bring his family up for a ski trip that coming weekend. His truck got deeply stuck in the snow. While he was outside, violently shoveling the snow trying to free his tires, he experienced a sudden, massive heart attack. Lying inside his freezing truck, writhing in excruciating pain and entirely convinced he was going to die right there on the mountain, he suddenly saw headlights illuminating the trees from down the road. It was around 11:30 p.m. He saw a car park a short distance behind him. He heard the muffled sound of voices drifting through the freezing air. Desperate for his life, Shones pushed his door open, stepped out of his truck, and yelled for help at the top of his lungs. Through the blinding glare of the headlights, he claimed he saw a group of men, and strangely, a woman holding a baby. But the very moment he called out to them, the voices instantly stopped. The headlights were abruptly shut off. The pitch-black woods went dead silent. Shones called out again, pleading for them to help a dying man. He received absolutely no answer. It was as if the group had dissolved into the shadows. Shones eventually managed to survive the night and painfully walked back down the mountain the next morning to get help. His story baffled investigators. The footprints around Madruga's abandoned car perfectly matched the 5 missing men. But who was the woman with the baby? And why on earth would these 5 friendly, gentle men completely ignore a dying man screaming for help in the pitch-black woods? Before the police could launch a full-scale ground search of the deep forest, severe winter storms battered the mountain range. A brutal blizzard dumped snow continuously for weeks, piling up to 15 feet high in some areas. The search had to be entirely called off. It was too dangerous for the rescue teams. The parents of the 5 men were left in a state of agonizing, unending limbo. Months slowly passed. The heavy snow slowly began to melt as the warmth of spring finally arrived. In early June, exactly 114 days after the men disappeared into the night, a small group of motorcyclists were riding their dirt bikes on a very rough, remote trail deep inside the forest. They were nearly 20 miles uphill from the spot where the Mercury Montego had been abandoned. They came out into a clearing and stumbled upon a United States Forest Service trailer. It was a small, heavy-duty cabin used by park rangers during the summer months. The bikers noticed that the front window of the trailer had been violently broken out. Curious and slightly uneasy, they parked their bikes and looked inside the shattered window. The overwhelming smell of decay hit them first. Then, peering into the gloom, they saw the body. It was Ted Wire. He was lying squarely on a bed, completely wrapped from head to toe in 8 thick sleeping bags and heavy blankets. He was severely emaciated, his body reduced to a skeleton covered in skin, and his feet were completely ruined by severe frostbite. The bikers fled in terror and notified the authorities. When investigators swarmed the remote trailer a few hours later, the scene they documented inside made absolutely no logical sense. It defied human survival instincts. Forensic analysis revealed that Ted Wire had lived inside that dark, freezing trailer for up to 3 agonizing months after the night he went missing. His thick beard growth and the extreme loss of body weight indicated he had survived for many weeks, slowly and painfully starving and freezing to death. But the trailer was fully stocked with emergency supplies. All around the room were heavy winter coats, insulated boots, and extra sleeping bags, all left completely untouched. There was a large propane tank sitting right outside the trailer, directly connected to a large space heater inside. All Ted or his friends had to do was reach out and turn a simple metal valve to flood the room with life-saving heat. The valve was never turned. There were dozens of paperback books, paper materials, and wooden furniture that could have easily been used to start a fire in the fireplace. There were dry matches sitting right on the table in plain sight. No fire was ever made. But the most horrifying discovery of all was the food supply. In a small storage shed directly attached to the outside of the trailer, there was enough freeze-dried food, canned vegetables, fruits, and heavy military rations to comfortably feed all 5 men for an entire year. Investigators found that a tiny handful of cans had been opened and eaten. They were opened with a specialized military P-38 can opener. Gary Mathias, the only Army veteran in the group, was known to carry this exact type of can opener on his keychain. But after those first few cans, the men just stopped eating. The rest of the massive food hoard, literally an arm's length away from where Ted lay dying, was left completely untouched. Ted Wire, a man who weighed over 200 pounds when he vanished after the basketball game, weighed just 73 pounds when he was found wrapped in those blankets. He had slowly starved to death in a room absolutely overflowing with food. The police immediately fanned out to search the surrounding wilderness. Within a few days, the grim discoveries continued. They found the remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling in a deep drainage ditch along the dirt road leading up to the trailer. Autopsies showed they had died of extreme hypothermia while attempting the grueling 20-mile hike up the mountain in the pitch dark. Further deep into the dense woods, searchers found the scattered, animal-scavenged bones of Jack Hewitt. His jeans and shoes were left nearby, and his father's heavy jacket, which he had been proudly wearing that night, was found discarded miles away. But Gary Mathias, the Army veteran and the most capable survivor of the group, was never found. The only trace of him was his low-top tennis shoes, which were found sitting neatly inside the trailer next to Ted's bed. It appeared that after Ted passed away, or perhaps shortly before, Gary put on Ted's heavier, warmer leather boots, stepped out of the trailer into the unforgiving winter wilderness, and walked away into oblivion. He was never seen or heard from again. The tragedy of the Yuba County Five leaves behind a chilling, impenetrable wall of questions. What terrifying thing drove these 5 men to abandon a perfectly safe working car and march 20 miles uphill through deep, freezing snow into total darkness, wearing nothing but light jackets? Why did they ignore Joseph Shones as he begged for his life? And, most hauntingly, why did the survivors, who actually reached the safety of the trailer, refuse to use the heat, the fire, or the massive pile of food that could have easily saved their lives? Psychologists and investigators have theorized for decades. Some believe the men saw something illegal or terrifying happening on that logging road, perhaps related to the mysterious woman and baby that Shones claimed to have seen. Maybe they genuinely believed they were being hunted in the dark. Their specific cognitive challenges might have caused them to panic entirely, their minds unable to process the fear, leading them to make highly irrational decisions. When they finally reached the Forest Service trailer after hiking for days in the snow, they had to break a window to get inside. It is highly likely they were so deeply afraid of getting in trouble with the law for breaking and entering into government property that their rigid minds refused to allow them to touch the supplies. They might have huddled together in the freezing dark, paralyzed by rules and fear, simply waiting for someone to come save them, until the bitter, cold, and unrelenting hunger slowly took them one by one. Ted Viher, known by his family to lack common sense but possessing an incredibly gentle soul, might have simply stayed in the bed where his friends tucked him in, patiently waiting for Gary to bring back help that would never arrive. There is a quiet, haunting beauty and immense tragedy in their final days. They never turned on each other. The ones who made it to the cabin tried their best to care for Ted. They tucked him into bed. They wrapped him in every blanket they could find. They stayed by his side in the dark. It speaks to a profound truth about life. Sometimes, the most innocent, trusting, and gentle souls among us are the most vulnerable to the chaotic, unforgiving nature of the world. Life demands a harsh adaptability. A single wrong turn in the dark, a moment of blinding panic, or a stubborn adherence to the rules, even when survival is on the line, can lead to devastating consequences. Their story is a stark reminder that the wilderness does not care about your good intentions, your fears, or your innocence. The physical world is entirely indifferent. The thick mountain forest swallowed their final moments, keeping the true, horrifying sequence of events locked permanently beneath the winter snow. The parents of the 5 men lived out the rest of their days consumed by the agonizing question of what chased their boys up that mountain. And Gary Mathias remains missing to this very day, a ghost wandering the Plumas National Forest. The strange case of the Yuba County 5 remains one of the darkest, most impenetrable mysteries of the American outdoors. There are many more stories hidden in the dark corners of the world, waiting to be uncovered. And perhaps the next one will chill you even deeper to the bone.